Hi, I'm Greg Lewis, Senior Principal Researcher at Microsoft Research in New England, and I'm here today with Totte Harinen, a Senior Causal Inference Expert at Toyota Research Institute, Dawen Liang, a Senior Data Scientist at Netflix, and Yashu, a VP and Head of Data Science at LinkedIn. We're here to talk about the role of causal machine learning in the tech world. And the way I'd like to kick this panel off is by asking each of you to introduce yourselves and say a little bit about how you ended up working in the space of causal inference. And we'll kick it off with Totte and then Dawen and Liang.
Thank you, Greg. My name is Totte, and as Greg mentioned, I work at the Toyota Research Institute. The way in which I got into causality, I think it started during my graduate studies in philosophy, which kind of initially may sound a little bit strange, but actually, when you think about it, of course, philosophers were the first ones to really start thinking about these issues, and it's been a big topic in that field for like 300 years at least. And so I started kind of looking into that, and I got interested in that question. And then at some point, I realized that, well, if I want to kind of work on this topic, I better understand also how empirical researchers are using it, and then started looking at that, and soon afterwards realized that actually this empirical stuff is what I want to do. So then ended up looking at positions in the tech industry, because it seemed to me at the time as to be the area where these kinds of methods are relevant and applicable. And worked for a couple of years at Uber, and now most recently I've been working at Toyota Research Institute, working on these causal inference applications, looking at policy interventions, experimentation, and anything in between.
So just a quick follow-up, because I'm curious, when you went to grad school in philosophy, what did you think you were going to study?
I was broadly interested in kind of philosophy of science, so scientific explanation and those kinds of things. Of course, causality, I ended up kind of arguing in my PhD that scientific explanation largely is causal explanation. So that's why kind of causality became more and more important over time. So I roughly stuck in the same area, but what was really unexpected to me was this increasing focus on empirical questions and actual estimation. So I had to study a lot of statistics and programming during my PhD to be able to move towards that.
Super interesting. I feel like we'll come back to the question of what are good stories or what are good narratives that you can attach to causal estimates later, because I think that's so important for policymaking. But let's move on to you, Dawen. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Greg. So I'm Dawen. I'm a research scientist at Netflix, where I mainly work on personalization algorithms and recommendation, etc. So I think I first got into causality also in grad school around 2014-ish, when back then my very visionary PhD advisor, David Bly, he got really into causality. In 2014, actually, causality was definitely not as like a widely discussed topic as like it is nowadays. So we read a couple books and lost a lot of hair, and the more we read, and the more we start to realize actually this is such a difficult field, in the sense that it's really hard to make any like a causal statement, especially with like observational data. So that's roughly where I got started, and also that's roughly also where we started first to think about recommender system actually as like an intervention from a causality perspective, which is, I mean, it's a long way, but it's probably what eventually led me to hear this panel today.
Very cool. And we're definitely going to return to the topic of causality and recommendation systems. So we'll be back there in a second. But let's ask you to introduce yourself.
Hi, and I can introduce them. Yeah, I'm from LinkedIn. I lead the data science and AI teams. And how did I get into causal inference? I wanted to say that I did not lose my hair over causal inference during my PhD. So yeah, so even though that I did get my PhD in statistics, you may think that I must have studied a lot of causal inference in graduate school, but in the contrary, because I went to Stanford and the department was actually very much applied statistics is very much focused on statistical machine learning. So I was actually trained in machine learning and didn't do any causal inference until I had my first job. So my first job was in the applied research team in Bing at Microsoft, and apparently I was the very first statistician they hired. And when they had causal problems, they naturally think, oh yeah, we'll know how to solve this. So I learned how to solve those causal inference problems when I was at my first job. So from there on, I lost some hair, I guess, and then I moved on to work at LinkedIn, and at LinkedIn, I put together the experimentation team and really built our sort of the global experimentation platform that is really driving the large scale experimentation that is happening. We run the hundreds of parallel experiments every single day at LinkedIn. Yeah, so that's my story of how I got into causal inference.
I'm glad that you didn't have quite the stressful experience that Dawen did with the hair loss. Maybe we're gonna getting into some of the more detailed questions. I wanted to maybe reverse the order and start with you. Then. And in your current job, you must have a really high level perspective as a VP in the way that causal machine learning is used at LinkedIn. And I'm curious, going back to Darwin's earlier point, it's really taken off. It's a big thing, causal machine learning now. How's that changed for you over the last few years? And what kinds of skills are necessary in a company for the data science team to have, or the data science group to have, to really change business decision making?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It has changed quite a bit. When I first started at LinkedIn, we barely had any basic randomized controlled experiments running, right? So I think in the early days was a lot more focused on let's just do basic, 2-sample t-test. And then from there on, I want to say one of the critical turning point was about 2016 when we changed our app entirely. So in the past, LinkedIn has our what we call like a sort of our old version of our app. 2016 was when we revamped our mobile app entirely. And then to do that, we couldn't run A/B tests anymore because there is, you put your app in the app store and people started to adopt, and that's, you really don't have the luxury of doing a randomized control experiment. And then so that was the initial starting point when we started to really look into, hey, how can we draw causal conclusion without having the luxury of run randomized experiment, utilized doubly robust and with exact matching, which is the method that we use. So that was the starting point of, I want to say, more of the causal machine learning. And we started, and then from there on, obviously we have gone a long way. Now we actually do have a tool or platform, if you may say, that we have built various different causal machine learning toolkit and methods for people to be able to just use, and they can obviously, if filling some forms, drop downs, and putting their data, and then run a button, and is able to actually give you some nice results. At least be able to address maybe 80% of a lot of the observational causal studies that we need to do. And certainly going back to your question of what kind of skills that's needed. So even for individuals who didn't come in with a lot of experience of doing causal machine learning, that they are able to, based on the tool, to get a lot of the work done. But when it comes to something that's more sophisticated, obviously we needed individuals who usually comes in with a lot of statistical or economics backgrounds are individuals who, and with the kind of training that they are able to solve something that's more sophisticated.
So one thing that seems important here in this story is the development of this infrastructure, right? That you now have this tool that allows sort of it allows people with many kinds of backgrounds to easily get results that are useful and can be impactful in sort of making decisions. We're going to talk about this later when we talk about a little bit about causal ML and potentially maybe econ ML as well. How do you what's important? What do you think about when designing this basic infrastructure piece? What does it need to do in order to make data scientists more effective?
I want to say, first of all, really understanding that this is still a very much evolving field as well. Like there is no sort of one approach that works for all. So certain approaches, like depending on the data that you have, depending on the set of the problem, that different approaches work better, right? So, sometimes the panel works better. Sometimes it's, maybe BSTS work better. Sometimes maybe IV works better. And then so I think being able to provide a flexibility and extensibility in the tools and platforms that you're building is really important. And one thing that we have also learned is we certainly have a central team that is responsible for the tool up running and the sort of the core foundational pieces of the tool. But what matters even more so is when the platform is extensible, that data scientists who come up with something new, they can onboard onto the platform so that all the other folks can leverage and use. It can be extremely powerful.
And that must be an interesting then part of the job opportunity is to do sort of maybe some is to find new techniques that work for your particular data set and then build them in so everybody else can use them. Which we've certainly had this experience in econ ML as well, is that then people who are working on sort of data science for particular problems suddenly get to contribute to the general space, which is kind of a nice opportunity, it seems.
Absolutely.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Okay, well, let me ask Totte then about his work in Causal ML, and maybe you guys can sort of go back and forth a bit about this. But I know that when you were at Uber, you spent a lot of time working on that Causal ML package, and it's definitely a package we've looked at closely here at Microsoft Research. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of that? Where did that come from? What problems was it supposed to solve, and what were the big design choices you made?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very much related to what you mentioned and your discussion. I think, part of my job at Uber was to build these internal tools for various kinds of analytics, but causal inference in particular. And I think there were kind of two main areas. One is observational studies, where we would have these methods like matching and all the rest, and then there was the question of how to gain better insights from randomized experiments. And I found that there was a big difference between those two in terms of the scalability of the approaches, in the sense that when we are dealing with observational studies, it is much more difficult to kind of release those kinds of tools in a big company in such a way that anyone can use them, because they come with these assumptions that you would need to assess and validate, and it is simply much more difficult compared to tools that built on top of randomized experiments where the assumptions are fewer. And so with the Causal ML in particular, this was mostly a tool that we built for the context of randomized experiments. And it was initially used in like marketing context and those kinds of situations where you would want to see how an intervention works for different subgroups. So it was and still is a package that is largely focused on that context of randomized experiments. Some of the considerations that we needed to take into account building this tool at Uber were scalability. Of course, we are dealing with very large data sets with lots of features, lots of samples as well. So how can we look at randomized experiments where we have millions of users and hundreds or thousands of features? And another one that we wanted to emphasize was a uniform API for that library, such that it's easy and easy for data scientists to use. It has a similar API as scikit-learn. So, so those were the two kind of considerations that we initially needed to take into account internally, and then we ended up also open sourcing it, and it's turned out that it's actually something that's resonated, I think, in the data science community at large. So it's done quite well since we open sourced it in 2019.
So this is maybe a question for both of you then. When you move from experimental data, well, actually, let me start with something slightly different. I'll tack back to observational data. But in the case of experimental data, essentially you're talking about estimating heterogeneous treatment effects. And I guess one question is, how useful has that been to decision makers to have some sort of measures of heterogeneity among the population? Is this something that's turned out to be kind of important in practice, or has not been such a major feature of how LinkedIn and Uber at the time were making decisions? And I should probably say one of you should go first, because otherwise it's hard to know. Yeah, why don't you speak first?
Sounds good. It's definitely helpful. I want to say that particularly, not necessarily as in, first of all, I think it's very helpful when you have heterogeneous treatment effects as insights, right? Hey, I launched a new feature. Hey, but it maybe only work well for people in US, but it didn't work well for people in India. So we certainly have been able to utilize the tool. We also built similar tools that Totte mentioned as well at LinkedIn to be able to identify those insights. But what's even more useful for us is to be able to then think about how we can modify and evolve our product so that it works better for everyone. Right. So I think a lot of times it's very easy for us to looking at the average and be like, oh, everything is better, but then without realizing that maybe it's actually shifting the value from one group of population to another group of population. So it's been very valuable to us.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. I think looking at these insights from past experiments has been and is valuable in the sense that you can kind of devise some hypothesis about why it might be that this intervention that you're testing is or isn't working. I think it's tricky with these models though, because you're still looking at correlations between features and treatment effects. So you don't really get to the causality without some further assumptions. Another use case at Uber and elsewhere is of course looking more into the future. So if you have trained this kind of model for a certain intervention, then it was quite common to build kind of targeting models that then looking forward for future users can serve these interventions in such a way that we can expect whatever outcome it is that we're interested in to be optimized. So that was of course another very typical use case for these kinds of tools.
If I can add one more thing here, I think.
Go ahead, yeah.
I think the heterogeneous treatment effects, when you are looking at maybe a very small preset and segments, is very different from if you say, hey, I'm just looking for this large search space of maybe like multiple dimensions of continuum, continuous variable. So in the former is where it's sort of the insights is really helpful, and then but then the latter, what we do is a lot of times we don't. And this is maybe the classical multiple testing problem, right? So we don't necessarily just take it and run with it, but we would actually then like test it again, right? So if we say, hey, you know what, like maybe this population reacts differently, but we kind of turned all the stones and we found this. So let's just rerun the experiment on those small segment in particular, and see is that just a spurious correlation or spurious discovery or not.
Yeah, I mean that issue, especially with things being kind of uninterpretable, often, you kind of go, I get these groups. You then want to check that they're already there in a little while, and then you want to understand what they even mean, even if you're sure that they're statistically. It's, well, what is this subgroup really? And is it, could I have divided my search space in a different way that would make it more interpretable, which I think is a hard problem. I wanted to bring Dawen in though as well, because I feel like I want to ask about recommendation systems at Netflix, but I'm also curious about whether you've had any experience with sort of heterogeneous treatment effect estimation at Netflix, and whether that's proved important in practice.
Oh yeah, sure. So I think at Netflix we have probably I guess roughly speaking, two different area where causal inference can be made useful. So one is the one that I'm more familiar with, which is around recommendation personalization from a modeling perspective. But then also on the other hand, we also have a very large group of analysts who work on basically we run a lot of randomized A/B tests, and then we need to derive insights from it. And as it turns out, heterogeneous treatment effect is very useful when you try to analyze what your A/B test has done, because both of you have mentioned, it's quite possible that you run A/B tests and then you saw that, well, the overall results looks healthy or not healthy or maybe flat, but then when you actually dive into the nitty-gritty, different partition of the user population, different country, etc., you realize things are not really going in the same direction. And that's where knowing about heterogeneous treatment effect can prove very useful. But I mean, in the meantime, I think we also try to be very cautious about actually estimating heterogeneous treatment effect, because you have much smaller sample size. You need to be more careful about whether you are making a statement that actually doesn't really exist. So I guess that's basically what I can add to that.
So there seems to be broad consensus that this is very useful. You have to be very careful about how you do it. Otherwise, you might find something that's not really there. And also Ya's point about it really being about identifying subpopulations that maybe are not being well served by your products. I wondered if any of you actually have sort of an example in mind of a case where the products were evolved slightly as a result of what you found from the heterogeneous treatment effects.
I can share something. We certainly we have found in a lot of our how our communication channels work with our members, either that is email or notification, etc., actually works very differently depending on the maybe device people are using, depending on the country, the geographic locations that people are in. So one example would be, let's say we have people who sign up to get job alerts when they are looking for jobs. They wanted to be notified as soon as the jobs are posted on LinkedIn, right? And then so because of the delivery mechanism may be different, and then we gotta just have to make sure that we optimize being able to get those sort of the essential alerts to the job seekers as soon as possible. So we have tweaked our mechanisms for how we do that based on the sort of maybe more geo-based results that we have seen.
And is this an example of policy targeting in the way that Totte was saying, that you're going to say this kind of person in this kind of place likes to get the job alert by this way? As maybe distinct from saying, I'm actually missing a product, right? I see this set of users and these people are all happy, but this group is really not happy at all. They need a slightly different product. We need to do market research to even figure out what we would do to make them happier.
Yeah, I actually also have another example for that. So many actually.
Okay, great.
Maybe like maybe 3 years ago, we used to on LinkedIn, we have a little referral button, right? So if you are applying for a job, you can say, I want to get a referral from, and then from that experiment, one thing we noticed is that people who have very big network, they are really the ones who are benefiting from that referral button. And then those, obviously, those who don't have a strong network, they don't, right? So what we decided is we actually decided to take that feature off because we wanted to make sure that as we're providing benefits like that, we wanted to make sure that folks who don't have that high of a social capital can still have that access to the opportunity equally. So that's maybe another example.
Super interesting. And I want to return to this issue of equity and fairness later because this seems like this is connected. But before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about recommendation systems and how causal reasoning works there. So yeah, tell me a little bit about what the role of causality is in designing Netflix's recommendation system, Dawen.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the definition of causality can actually be either very narrow, i.e. just like estimating some treatment effect from some randomized control trial, but that can also actually be very broad. In fact, recently a colleague of mine actually said that as long as you can write like the quantity that you want to estimate or optimize as expectation over the policy that generate data, then it is causal. Which is really broad, but actually, if you think about it, I think that's actually quite true. And this perspective also connects nicely to like a lot of related fields. For example, in machine learning, there are like contextual bandits and reinforcement learning literature, as well as I guess in statistics about the missing data theory. So I think this perspective actually connects nicely to all of those areas as well. So I'm actually going to go with this more broader definition. So I guess back to your question about like how to keep causality in mind when designing recommender systems. I guess so you might know that actually in the past, like maybe 5-10 years ago, in industry, which is actually the time that I was not in industry yet, but I heard those stories. In the past, people mostly treat like recommender system as more like a supervised learning problem. Like you collect a bunch of data, and for each user, each item, you have some features, and you try to train a predictive model to say, well, giving the feature from this user, how likely she or he will like this particular item. And this actually has worked probably pretty well at first, for the first few years. But the problem is basically it might work very well at first, but at some point you're very likely to hit a wall in the sense that you try really hard to improve your offline accuracy of your supervised learning model, and then you are very hopeful, and then you deploy it online, and then you see, oops, it didn't actually make any significant change. And actually, the more mature your system is, the more likely you're going to run into this wall. Really, I think the reason this is happening is because you're really not taking like causality into perspective. Because when you train a supervised learning model, you're really making an observational statement. But really, when you actually say deploy your recommender system, like say I recommend a certain title to a certain user, you are really actually doing an intervention, and you are not really. So I guess if you are talking in like I guess the pros do calculus, you are actually asking about the do something intervention rather than actually just observationally giving a new recommendation. And thinking from this perspective, I mean, it doesn't really solve your problem, but it kind of opens up the possibility and also makes you think a lot harder about what your recommender system will actually do to the user. And this will enable you to think a lot about the problem of, for example, the positional bias. Like when you create a recommender list, like if it's a list, then you know people probably are more likely to click on the thing that ranks on the top as opposed to the bottom. And also, you also likely to think about the feedback loop, so-called, which is like your training data for today is coming from your model deployed yesterday. And this actually creates a feedback loop, which can potentially be very harmful if you don't take care of it very well. So again, I guess thinking causally actually doesn't really like magically make your problem disappear, but it definitely opens up your mind and to think a lot harder around a lot of common problems that we encounter like in recommender system.
I'm just trying to think through this logic. I haven't thought about this before, so I'm trying to do it in real time. But it feels a little bit like we thought that the problem was just to predict whether you like the movie or not, and so that feels like a prediction problem, whether you're going to like the movie or not. But actually, you're going to do this intervention, and what you care about is whether somebody's going to change their actions in response. They're going to watch the movie or not. And so when you do this intervention, when you do this operation, you might change lots of things. And so it's not just about whether you're going to predict what movies they like or not, but it's like which kinds of interventions on the system are going to lead to more people watching movies, which is a different problem, a definitely a causal problem. Does that sound right?
Yes, I think, but really, I guess one bigger challenge is that when you think about really like estimating causal effect of a recommender system, you really have to make a very good balance between providing, I guess, relevant recommendation, but also you need to provide, I guess you can kind of say like more trendy recommendation, because you can imagine if you purely think from the perspective of like causal recommender systems, then you would probably want to find out the recommender, like the title, that actually can give you the largest, whatever you call like the treatment effect, i.e. like if I recommended this title, this user might watch for this long, but if I don't recommend it, it probably will never watch it. But if you think from this perspective, the problem is you might actually end up recommending a lot of title that is probably not very familiar to this user. You imagine when they log into your Netflix and you see a full screen of title that we magically know that you will love if you watch it, but when you see that page, you will like, what's that? So yeah, it's a tricky balance to really strike. As you can imagine, you cannot go full causal, but you can also not go full like observational and predictive. So it's like, yeah, you need to think about the balance of those two.
That balance is super familiar to me. I actually I should talk to you offline because I have a paper that's about like exactly this topic of like things that look things that are going to be good, but the things that the user will also think are good, and you have to get both of those things. You show them something they've never seen before, they don't agree with you, and they don't do what you want them to do. It's an intervention. Super interesting. But I'm realizing we're actually running out of time, and I've got so many questions left, which is a shame. Let me quickly throw this out to the panel. We've been talking about observational data and the challenges it poses, and often it's the case that we're leaning on unconfoundedness. We're leaning on the fact that you're controlling for everything. This must go spectacularly wrong sometimes. When has this gone really wrong? And how do you teach data scientists to identify when things are going horribly wrong so that they don't come back with nonsensical results? And to anybody, just jump in.
I'm happy to start because I mentioned earlier that we have tools that essentially democratizing observational causal inference to many data scientists who may not be experts in causal studies. So a couple of things that we do is part of the tool. We do provide a lot of analysis to make sure that we evaluate those assumptions. For example, if you have a study, you're saying, hey, sorry, because something I did today is actually causing something that I'm doing tomorrow. Like, can you say, if I also reverse the variables and then like somewhat happen to be something is going to happen tomorrow is causing what you're doing today, then that's obviously invalidate your study, right? So we have a lot of those checks in place. So that's number one in the tool directly. Number two is we also have this what we call sort of a causal committee, where when the study is done, with the report, that actually we have a group of experts who do take a look at it and review it. So that just kind of add another layer. People can still use the tool to almost like to funnel through ideas, and then if as long as they're not claiming that this is causal, like they can use it to say, hey, let me find drivers for this, this engagement, etc. But if they want to just say this is causal, then the committee will kind of have to get their rubber stamp on it, to making sure that it's those assumptions are all checked through.
Super interesting. That seems like a good institutional check. Anybody else on this topic? Or I have another question, which I'll throw it to somebody different. Anyone?
I can.
Go ahead, Dawen. Yeah.
So sorry, I can briefly chime in because again, I guess like I said earlier. So when we think about recommender system from like a causal perspective, it's probably not really, I guess, in the conventional sense of trying to accurately estimating treatment effect, like make sure everything is identifiable, and also those that kind of more standard stuff, because none of them actually can happen in our case when we have pure observational data and a lot of uncontrollable randomization. But one thing that is really have hurt us a lot in the past is what's I guess so-called the time travel issue, which is basically like when you try to train well, I mean, it sounds cool, but it's not as cool as it sounds. But anyway, yeah, but anyway, so as you can imagine, like in the past when you treat like a recommender system as like a predictive problem, you want to throw in as many features as you want and as possible, and sometimes you suddenly see, oh, I have such a huge gain. There must be something really great happening. But then as you dig deeper, you realize, oops, I probably include a variable that actually tells me what happens in the future, but well, I try to predict what's happening in the past. For example, I mean, this is purely a hypothetical example, but let's say I take the feature as like I watched the second episode of the Stranger Things, and then the model tried to predict if I have watched the first episode of Stranger Things. Right. The model was like, okay, of course you have watched the first episode, but that doesn't tell you anything, right? So that's why it's called time travel, and it's not as cool as it sounds. But yeah, I think this is like not exactly, I guess, fit into the conventional like causal estimation and identification, but I think it's like actually very relevant as well.
That's great. So I think what we're learning is that in fact, although we have a large body of techniques which are kind of standardized and well studied, in fact, many of the sort of the challenges of making systems work well at tech companies are about other things. It's about institutions and committees that are reviewing things and tools that are checking for common errors and sort of aspects that are not directly about are you using double machine learning versus sort of an orthogonal forest or whatever, right? These various kinds of techniques. I wanted to go next into a topic that kind of got touched on a little bit by Ya earlier when she was talking about product development. And there's this question of equity, which is a big, or fairness in tech, which is a big issue at the moment for good reason. And thinking about how to design systems that are treating all groups equally. And I wonder, especially as people who are building tools that estimate heterogeneous treatment effects, how you guys think about that issue and how you may implement checks for it within an organization. And Totte, maybe I could go to you because you haven't had a chance to speak lately much. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that goes back to the discussion that we had about trying to give an interpretation. First of all, if you see some differences between different groups, what is the underlying cause? And I think here the methods are still lacking a little bit. I think it's usually some kind of manual process that you go through to try to identify, or try to explain why a certain intervention, certain product might not be working for particular groups of people. So what is my hope for future research is that we can build some systematic way of doing this type of analysis, which would make it more transparent in these cases where we look at hundreds or thousands of features, and then we would be able to spot more easily what is the explanation for differences that we might see, and if there is an explanation that is to do with lack of fairness. So that's my hope for future research. I think another interesting and very relevant area is not only kind of like how we build these algorithms in such a way that we can take fairness into account. I think another one is how we can do analysis with these methods that helps with fairness. One example in my current work, I'm looking at interventions that help with climate change or interventions that could help to reduce people's carbon footprint. And I think that's a kind of other way in which we can use these tools to address issues that are relevant to equity and fairness and those kinds of things. So I think those are probably two aspects that come to my mind, how we can improve things with this in this area broadly.
Yeah, I definitely endorse the view that we can use these tools to figure out where there are problems and then try to address them, which seems like a huge advantage. We have just a little bit of time left. I thought maybe I'd give everybody a minute to say something about where they wish would be in 10 years when it comes to causal inference. What are we hoping for 10 years from now? And maybe I'll go Dawen, Totte.
That's such a hard question. I would just say that in 10 years, drawing causal conclusion will be so much easier than it is today. I just hope that, thinking about 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, where we were with regarding randomized control experiments with very small scale, and to today, all the big companies are doing hundreds of experiments at a time. And I wanted to be able to see that with, non-randomized experiments as well, to be able to do it at that scale.
Dawen, any thoughts?
Yeah, 10 years is a really long time, but I think right now we are really starting to touch the surface of thinking of recommender system as I guess some might call a multi-causal inference, in the sense that you don't have a single cause for each user, because for each user you have multiple titles you can recommend. You can really think of those as correlated treatment, which might make this completely hopeless problem slightly hopeful. And I hope, I think there has been a lot of very interesting development in this area in the last couple of years. So I really hope in 10 years, we are able to much better understand this whole area, and hopefully we will have a much better way to address all the causal problem that we encounter in recommender system, and from both actually the predicted part and the model, and also the evaluation part.
Great. And Totte, the last word is yours.
Yeah, I think there are two areas. So one is that we, in the tech world, of course, we are running all these experiments and doing all this analysis, but I think the vast majority of companies are kind of still catching up, and I'm just excited to see when experimentation and these kinds of methods, when they get more widely adopted, what comes out of it. So I think many companies are just getting started, and it is really exciting to see how that goes. Another area that will be very interesting to watch is, for example, right now we are sponsoring some research that comes from Judah Fell's lab at UCLA, and they are developing methods for combining observational and experimental studies to do this kind of estimation. We've talked about conditional treatment effect estimation, for example, to do that more effectively. So I think for tech companies, that's a little bit untapped, how you combine information from various experiments with observational data, how you start combining these different types of data to do this work even more effectively. So yeah, I'm just super excited for the next 10 years. I don't know where we're going to be, but it's going to be exciting.
Well, thanks very much to everybody. I'm also very excited about the future of causal inference. I'm looking forward to a world where even if we can't quite get it to the level of experiments, we can at least sort of have methods that work pretty well most of the time in a large variety of settings, and maybe combine that with experiments. Thanks so much to all of you for participating in the panel. It's been a treat to listen to you and to get your views. I hope you invent the future in the next decade.